When it came down to the housing crisis, and you seen in the likes of New York and San Francisco, 49 to about and 46% of the housing was overoccupied by singular persons. People who were otherwise living with their parents or living with their flatmates, etc. In other words, they overoccupied those housing. But another thing I didn't really touch upon, like I say, is the quality deterioration. So what happens is basically the landlords lose basically the incentive because they're running at a loss. Landlords do not make as much as what folk think they do. And when the landlords are running at a loss and they've got to cover the costs of repairs, whether it's hiring a plumber or an electrician if something goes wrong with any of the rented property, they've got to be able to afford those costs in order to cover that. If you're forcing landlords into a loss, then of course they've got to make a living. They end up running off. It's not the fault of the landlord, it's the fault of government and its rent controls. So what ends up happening is they end up running off because they don't want to get the blame for it. See, if the landlord remains there and just runs at a loss, the government would blame them for it.
At the recent Labour Party conference, Jeremy Corbyn announced that a Labour government would introduce rent control in many cities around the UK and made it clear that regeneration is a thin veil for social cleansing.
And there you have it, folk. Basically, rent controls. When you reduce the price, just because you reduce the price, the underlying reality of the shortage goes nowhere. So the housing shortage is still there. Just because you've artificially lowered the price, that doesn't change that. The only thing you've done is basically lowered the price and consumer demand drives up. That's the laws of supply and demand. Price goes down, demand goes up. Price goes up, demand goes down. Simple as that. What the hell do you think happens when Jeremy Corbyn, would step in, artificially reduce the price of housing for rented housing? Of course, demand drives up. Quality deterioration happens. So in other words, it gets to a point where these people have been living in these apartments and stuff like that for several decades. The quality deteriorates so much, it no longer becomes inhabitable and the housing gets boarded up and they end up homeless. Convenient that, isn't it? Given the fact that, Jeremy Corbyn appeared to be very truthful.
Do you know what? I find him to be sincere.
Very honest, they says.
When you're talking to people, you just want the honest truth.
Oh, I feel and I believe.
And it feels like
When he speaks, I just believe him.
I believe what he says.
He gets away with that, right? Because most folk don't even understand economics. But who is it that benefits the most for these rent control laws because of the housing shortage? That's right, the rich. The Jeremy Corbyns. That's who benefits for it. So it comes of no surprise why he was supporting the rent control laws, and yet he was the one sitting in front of him, that poor guy, sitting there believing every word he was saying. He's saying, oh, it was all the fault of these private renters and stuff. It's all their fault. No, it's not. It's not their fault. It's not why the price is high. It's not because it's private. It's not because, it's the landlords, the evil, greedy landlords. No, it's because there's a shortage. And part of that was influenced by the immigration crisis, because there's a greater quantity coming into the supply of housing available. And government's regulation can also be, blamed for that. And someone rightly pointed out as well on zonal laws. So all of these things playing into the very reason for why there's a restriction on the market and you end up with that problem. That's why Boris Johnson's deregulation of the housing market was important, because then you can actually fix the problem, because the solution is to build more housing, and you will hear this, of course.
The thing about Corbyn is that he knows how to listen, he knows how to actually speak for those of us who have never had a voice before. So yeah, he's a different kind of leader, but he's the kind of leader we need right now.
She seems like a nice enough person in that. Again, it's one of these people who her heart's in the right place. She means well, all the good intentions. She doesn't understand dire consequences that would follow if Jeremy Corbyn got his way. For this reason, it's very difficult to tell whether Jeremy Corbyn is just incompetent or it's a case that he understands and he knows that the rent controls would have benefited the rich, basically himself. She just doesn't understand economics, and that's why it's so easy for these Labour Party politicians to lead them right up the garden path.
With people like Jeremy, people like myself, obviously I'm an MC as well, there's more of a connect. He seems more like a real person to us.
And there you have it. It's all about the feelings, how he feels. It's all these good intentions and everything. They feel and they believe and all the rest of that nonsense. If you listen carefully and you even pay attention to their arguments, they never really touch upon the policies. They don't really touch upon, oh well, here's why the rent controls would be so beneficial to us. They don't go into that detail because they don't have the confidence to do so, because they don't really have the knowledge on it. So they don't really go into detail and give information because they've not got the confidence. And I'm not having a go. Again, they mean well and everything like that, but a nice enough guy, but he just doesn't understand. This is why these politicians can so easily lead them on. If that boy had the knowledge on what rent controls cause, his support would change massively. We're in this mess today because people don't understand economics. That's it. That's as simple as that. And it's not me insulting people when I say this. What I'm saying is, and this is just the truth of the matter, it's not my opinion, it's a fact. Socialists don't understand basic economics.
By integrating health and social care into a single system so that everyone gets the care they need when they need it.
It's that rhetoric again about everybody deserves the care. Well, that's great and everything, everybody's not going to get the care. Just like we've seen of the full-blown nationalisation of the NHS for decades, right for its inception in 1948, even below here, 1958, this article, and the long waiting lines. Long waiting lines means there's neglect. Thousands of folk had been neglected every single year since 1948, and the reason for that is because of the so-called free at the point of use. That's the price you pay for it, because again, you can't ignore the laws of supply and demand. See, when you make something so-called free, everybody starts seeking treatment. And I've seen the argument, and it's a recent argument that was made. Somebody stupidly tried to say, oh, healthcare is inelastic. Before the so-called free at the point of use, before the NHS, people who otherwise didn't really need treatment weren't seeking treatment. As soon as the free at the point of use came about, all these people who had such minor problems began seeking treatment. In other words, consumer demand did drive up because of the free at the point of use. That's telling you that healthcare is not inelastic from the laws of supply and demand. He's going on about everybody getting the care. Not everybody's going to get it, because through what he proposes, thousands would be left neglect every single year. And it's not a case of just saying, oh well, but what about? See, it's all the what aboutery. Forget the what aboutery. It doesn't matter about the American healthcare system. What does that matter? I'm not in support of the American healthcare system, the American healthcare market. That's not an argument. That's not going to defend your position of the NHS being left with thousands in neglect because of the NHS being nationalised. You're not going to brush it under the carpet by just pointing to the United States of America. Again, I've covered that whole entire argument in a video, and you can check it out for yourself.
For the first time in a while, someone's come along who you might go for a pint with or watch football with or get in a bus with, and I think people are really inspired by that. I mean, whatever you think of his views, that alone is very kind of like individual. And I think kids can actually, not kids, just young people in general, can go, actually, I get him. Again, it's all the feelings, the emotions. It's not really about, the actual information, the content. They don't even go into any detail or nothing. Oh, he uses public transport. I can somewhat correlate to him, and therefore that's why they vote for him. It's because they don't really understand the economic arguments. If they understood, of course, they wouldn't have had that support from him as they did.
For the common sense voter, rent control will resonate, and the floating voter would have nodded along to Jeremy's speech as he announced this.
Well, when it comes down to common sense voters would never support such a thing. Even if they don't really understand it, those folk would not support such a position anyway, because they've had history there to speak for itself. That doesn't apply to these people who sadly are supporting it. Those who are nodding and agreeing with these type of policies and stuff, they really don't understand the consequences of their actions. You can pretty much see from a graph here, and even although it's not in a talk today with the housing market, you can see the percentage of British people who favour the idea of caps being put on things like gas, etc. It's unbelievable how many folk out there actually really don't have the first clue about economics, and it's dangerous. It really is. They don't understand that this is exactly what led them to such shortages. Even if they led down the road of attempting this with controls over electricity, they would end up with a power shortage. And again, it's repeating history or and or and or. And then after it happens, they then blame capitalism, say, oh, it's all greed. Not at all to do with greed. It's controls. Learn why price ceilings cause price shortage problems. If you actually studied that, you would then understand why it happens. It's no different when it comes to that of rent controls, it's the same principle.
I mean, it's interesting the whole Grime Corbyn thing, because for me personally, I always think that you shouldn't really vote for the leader, you shouldn't really personalise politics like that, it should really be the party. Yeah, it's because I think Grime, it just resonates with young people and the things that they're going through with like tuition fees and the NHS was a massive thing.
And there you have it, folk. It's really all down to the cost of living. I mean, there's a lot of well-meaning people who, they've got good intentions. Again, their heart's in the right place and all the rest of it. They see the cost of education, the cost of the American healthcare system, for example. It's the same story, and no matter which country you look at, and they can all reason with those arguments. This is why we need things like this universal healthcare, tuition fees. They want to get rid of that to make it free. They don't understand the consequences because they don't understand economics, and that's the thing that gets me, and I'll never understand this. A lot of these folk, they complain about the cost of living, etc., and they complain about all these things, but when you try to teach them, they don't want the truth. I don't understand that, and it is the truth, by the way. It is the truth. It's the God's honest truth. We do not live under capitalism. You would think they want to learn. You would think, the truth is something that they would want, but it isn't.
I refuse to accept that in Britain, the country which built the National Health Service, we cannot provide the social care everyone needs after suffering an accident or an illness. We're not fighting for luxuries, we're fighting for the basic hallmarks of civilization.
So again, it's all this stuff, the hallmark of civilization. The NHS isn't civilised, most certainly no, for the point that it neglects thousands every single year on record since 1948. It's no civilised because of the fact that it's a system that requires coercion in order to pay for it. It's not a civilised system at all, and it's a failure. It's never worked a single year in its entire history, and it's treated like a religious institution, which is disgusting to say the least. Folk can turn around and say to you, a free market in healthcare, oh, you only want healthcare affordable for the rich. Ask the question, where did I actually say that? Nowhere. Exactly. If you ask people what's a free market in healthcare, they couldn't tell you. We do not have a free market in education or free market in healthcare and stuff like that. Not because it was a failure, far from it. It's because of the fact that people are not educated on it. The mainstream media certainly won't do it. The education system certainly isn't doing it.
When you're talking to people, you just want the honest truth, and it feels like he's giving us the honest truth. So I feel like that's why he's resonated with Grime.
And again, there you have it. It's all the feelings. It feels like well-meaning, good intentions, heart's in the right place and all the rest of it. It's all about the feelings. It feels like, he's giving the honest truth. But he isn't. He just isn't.
However, there are many who don't agree with these proposals and said that Labour had not learned from past mistakes when rent control was in place. David Cox, chief executive of Arla Property Mark, said the last time rent controls existed, the private rented sector went from housing 90% of the population to just 7%. Whenever and wherever rent controls are introduced, the quantity of available housing reduces significantly and the conditions in privately rented properties deteriorate dramatically.
And that's exactly what I tell you folk. The quality deterioration, of course, landlords do not stick around to run at a loss, plus the fact you end up with a serious shortage. What I also explained to you is the fact that when consumer prices, when it goes down, demand drives up. The government tries to artificially lower that price, sets the rent control. What happens? Consumer demand soars out of control. The underlying reality of the shortage goes nowhere. All you've done is created an even greater shortage problem. It's one big comedy show, but of course, through the quality deterioration, what wasn't touched upon there, those people end up homeless and they lose their life, all because of a government disastrous policy that Jeremy Corbyn was going to impose. And of course, it benefits the rich. Surprise, surprise.
He went on to say, rent control is not the answer. To bring rent costs down, we need a concerted house building effort to increase stock in line with the ever-growing demand.
Exactly. In other words, the laws of supply and demand. You need to ensure that the supply, that the demand of housing, that supply keeps up with demand. That's how you rectify the problem. Nothing to do with private. It's not because there's an absence of council housing, it's the laws of supply and demand. And the funny thing was, like I said earlier, Jeremy Corbyn in his concession, he was acknowledging to a certain degree, there's not enough of it. If you've got a greater supply to that of the demand, then of course the costs drive down. It's sad because these people feel deep down that he was being truthful with them. Really, he's just been lying to them.
What do you think of Jeremy Corbyn? Do you know what? I find him to be sincere. And When he speaks, I just believe him.
You see, that's exactly the problem. It's all about how he said it, how he speaks. Not a case of the actual information, the actual content. They couldn't really tell you the problems with the rent controls, etc. Like I said, it's all of how he speaks, how they feel, they believe, etc. Their beliefs. Oh, I believe.
I believe what he says.
I feel.
Feels like. It feels like.
These politicians understand this. They know that. That's why they use all the rhetoric about, oh, the sick, the needy, the poor, the disabled. Nicola Sturgeon does it all the time. She knows what she's doing. And that's why I can't stand her. Because she's a liar. I don't like that. All those socialists could abuse me all they want. I don't care what the socialists do. They can abuse me all they want for saying this. It's the truth, right? The truth of the matter is, the reason why I don't like that is because I actually do care about people. And I do care about people like that. You know, I think it's very sad that they're being led up the garden path. I think it's very sad that they are so easily led on. They don't understand. She literally believes in all that. It's how he speaks. It's not a case of the actual content, and it's so easy to lead them on.